to have the opportunity to be on the other side of the world, but feel like I'm in your presence, seeing all your beautiful faces. Thank you for that. So what I share with you tonight is really a master pattern of how the human psyche works. It's not about our personalities, but it's very much about how we process information and what is our lens to the world and what we value in information. So often we have a number of misunderstandings. I can remember in my youth just absolutely spending hours trying to understand why there were such misunderstandings between people. And so tonight we're going to look at a little bit of why we do not understand each other, and 3 secrets to successful relationships, just as a way of introduction to this tool that I share with you tonight. So we all want the dream family, or we all want the dream relationships. And so, of course, when we have peace and harmony in our relationships, our life goes so well in other domains. So tonight, what I'm going to go through is to understand your children, your family, your friends, your colleagues, and your customers. Because this is a master pattern of human interaction, it's because it doesn't matter which relationship, it has an application. So even if you're not in a personal relationship, you have obviously close people that you're either working with or in your normal family. So we're looking at how we can prevent the relationships breaking down, how to improve your marriage if you're married, how to avoid separation, let alone divorce. For those of us that have been divorced, we know what a painful process that is. So all in all, to improve your understanding of all your relationships in life. So people generally want to understand each other, but frequently do not. They love their partners, but find it difficult to live with them. So we can often, particularly when we're early in a relationship, excuse me, we have so much love for each other, but often that love we chase off with a stick in the way we behave towards each other. So are you prepared to do what it takes for they're certainly prepared to do what it takes for their relationship to grow and want their relationships to succeed? None of us go into a relationship not wanting it to succeed, but we want a lasting, sustainable relationship. So if you have some of these desires, I can help you not only eliminate your misunderstandings, but to solve your relationship problems, but also to enrich all your relationships. So there are a series of tools and skills to master in any relationship problem. And it's a matter of once you understand the patterns that happen between you, you can handle any future difficulty when you know and have the right sort of guidance about how you handle it. So, of course, with a map of Sydney, you won't find your way around Brisbane or the Gold Coast. So we need an understanding of the map. And often parents would say, I wish I had an instruction manual. I wish you came with an instruction manual. And in fact, we do. It's a matter of knowing how to do that. So I work with people who want to have happy, healthy, and fulfilling relationships, and who are able and willing to learn the skills and tools to achieve flourishing relationships. For some reason, we think that simply by falling in love with a person or by having a close friendship with somebody, that's all it takes. All you need is love. Yes, you do need love, but also there are ways of understanding each other. So tonight, I'm going to share with you 3 tools in particular, because we've just got a short time to introduce this topic. Obviously, I've been working with this for the last 20 years, and I don't think a day has passed without me in some way referring to something about the way we function. So let's look at our first secret, and it's from storming to reforming. And we often have our own world and our own way of being, living in our own cocoon, and then we interact with others and we find they don't see it the same way we do. And we say, where did that person go that I loved? In the beginning, you were fascinated by each other. Now you have become more and more frustrated and critical of each other. So there's no need to continue to have disaffected, dysfunctional relationships. So it's really understanding that we have so much more knowledge now about how relationships work. So you've probably heard the notion there that we go from storming to reforming and to performing as such, but it is only natural that we go through a storming stage because and when we look at that, we go from the lack of cooperation to working out how we can be cooperative with each other. We go from I'll do my own thing and then sharing and going places together. We look at our partner sometimes or people around us and we think they're lazy. So it goes to understanding how to be hardworking in a way that works for both or for all people, from hateful to loving. And we could go on, but it's the whole notion that we certainly our soul energy understands that the people we attract into our life are there for us to really understand ourselves more and to understand how to reach each other. So do you want your relationship to, do you want her relationship to end up like this? And I think this is really just a beautiful pictorial comment about what happens in relationships sometimes. So we're all like the soft little pussycat. Then we become married and end up in a situation of, and then we become divorced. Well, that's for the woman, they say. Let's look what it means for the man. So it does not have to be her journey in life. And now look at, do we want his situation to end up like this? So single, magnificent. Married, we lose a few feathers along the way. And divorced, have you ever seen a chicken like this? When I saw these diagrams, I thought they were just hilarious to describe what can happen. So we obviously don't want this to be your or other people that you're associated with experience. So the journey doesn't have to be like this. So we want to obviously work with people together so you can go from despair to joy. And so, of course, often when we're in situations, we evoke anger in our response to others. And then we can get annoyed with each other. Then sometimes we think, oh, maybe I need to ask for some help here. But we don't know where to go or what to do because there's lots of different ways of approaching relationships. And so we hope that we can go from there, found it, and as such. So the second secret is discover the blueprint. So we all come with a blueprint in how we are in our life. And it's just a matter, in recent times, the social neurosciences have discovered a lot more about what happens inside the brain. So we want to find the keys to open others and your partner's instruction manual. And there is an instruction manual for each person. And we often believe that how we see the world is how everybody else sees the world and think the other person is purposely being difficult. How often have I spent so many hours trying to understand what's going on? And then when I learned some of these tools, I thought, now I understand. So we get very frustrated when a person does not interpret our message in the same way that we see it. And I'll share a little story here, which is a bit of an insight into when I was first married. I had been doing the housekeeping and doing the ironing, and I was all hot and bothered. And I went into the office to sit down and work. And of course, being in Queensland, it was very hot. So I went and opened the window, and my husband then really went off the deep end and said, you don't know about being married. All you think about is being in your own world. And so I realized that obviously I wasn't going to solve this scenario in a hurry because he had a head of steam about my actions. So I went straight to the issue and I said, well, what should I have said, or how could I have handled this? And he said, just ask me a question. So often the answer just lies in the other person, but we need to know the questions to ask. So no wonder that we have this disconnect, because research has discovered that there are 6 different ways our brain can be wired to connect with others and interpret the world around us and acquire values. And so this we are born with as a default setting. We obviously grow, develop, change, and our environment very much influences the way we develop. So nothing is that, well, I'm born this way, therefore just accept me the way I am. We can all grow, we can all develop. And we call this our social brain because it's what happens with our brain when it's at rest. And it takes in massive amounts of information around us of what's going on inside and outside of us. And so it's the way that we process all of those facts and data and information that we call our social brain. So we find the clues to our social brain in our verbal and non-verbal characteristics and expressions. So there are 6 identifiable patterns that we can learn. I'm just going to share a very simple set tonight so that you can start when you go to coffee lounges and places that you can start to observe some of these. So the first clue can be found by looking at our hand movements. I found that this is fairly accurate. It never changes, even though we develop and grow in our life, they tend to stay the same. So here, often if I say to people, what direction do you move your hands? You haven't got a clue. You're so busy focusing on what you're going to share with someone that you actually don't take notice of your hand movements. But one of the ways that you can do it is move your hands in that plane as we go through, and you'll find, is it comfortable for you? And if it's not your plane, then you will find it very uncomfortable. And we usually have 2 planes, but there is a general direction that you tend to observe, first of all, which tells you how we process information. So in the horizontal plane, as this little girl shows, your hands go out. So they move them from side to side, but mainly in a horizontal direction. So you'll find that people will make a lot of short staccato movements, or like this sort of thing when they're talking in a horizontal plane, or there'll be a more rolling, bigger movement that you'll see in people making these horizontal movements. This person has a relational social brain. So they work through an interactive part of their brain, and they like to interact and relate to others and express their love. So you'll find, I'll show you some pictures afterwards of what this looks like. So they use a lot of hand movements, and they express their emotions easily on their faces, and you can easily read them. So it's a bit like the weather. You can actually tell if a person is very expressive on their faces, whether they're in a good mood or not a good mood. So these people that show a lot of emotion on their face are a relational social brain. And they are very social and will communicate often with other people, even with strangers, so that they feel a comfort and an ease with people. All right, so then the next direction is the vertical plane. So you may not be able to see it, but it's more in up and down. And you'll find some people, their fingers are together, some their fingers are apart, but it's in an up and down plane. Now, for me to move my hands in that plane feels really uncomfortable for me, but some of you may find that very comfortable in the way they do it. But usually you often see the politicians. If you look at interviews with people, watch their hand movements, because that's one of the best ways. I often love watching television and thinking, can I work out what social brain they are? So this person has a mind social brain. So they first think about things before they do anything else. Whereas the relational person will ask questions and interact to find out and to clarify details. The thinking person or mind social brain will think first before they respond. They like to think and reflect about issues before they talk about them. So a relational person will often get very impatient with these people because they're not responding. And if you ask them what's going on, they say, I'm thinking. So of course you can't think and respond at the same time. So they use hand movements to give emphasis to a point. So they don't use as many hand movements, but you'll certainly see, either going like this or going like this when they respond to you. And they have fairly still facial expressions when listening, and they are often hard to read. So that if you're a relational person, you tend to look at this person and think that they're not understanding you or not connecting with you, when in actual fact, you probably have to look at their eyes to see if their eyes are shiny or dull. Because if they're shiny, they're with you. If they're dull, their head's somewhere else. And they're often quieter people amongst a group. For example, my daughter works from this level in thinking mode. I went to a christening party, or at least baby shower. And when I went there, every single one of them, except one person, was a mind social brain. So I go into the place and I sit there and everybody's just sitting and tuning to each other, not saying a word. And so as a relational person, I go in there and I'm feeling, oh, this feels really uncomfortable to me. And then there was one other person that was a relational person that I sat next to. But halfway through, once everybody had attuned and picked up on each other, you couldn't get a word in edgeways because they was very full of their chatter and conversation with each other. So these people in the sagittal plane is a backwards and forwards movement. So it's backwards and forwards from the body. And they often bring their hand back into their body, and touch their chest. So this person has an action social brain. So they tend to do first. They just get on with doing rather than thinking or interacting. And they like to act and show their love by doing. So that I know Reza often shares the story of when he's associated with an action person, is that the way that he can connect by is going and doing something with them rather than having a conversation. So we respond in quite different ways according to the way that we work. So that usually an action person has few hand movements and they only use their hands to make a point. So they give particular emphasis to what they're saying, and you'll notice that it will be a particular, but their hand movements are quite slow and soft, so that you'll see they're not the quick, scattered or rolling movements of the relational person or the up and down movements, but they tend to be slow and soft. And if a person's not making many hand movements, they're either a mind or an action person. But the difference with the action person is that these movements are very graceful and so slow and soft. And they tend to look at you with a regarding expression. So they're not in your face or in any way intimidating, but these are people that tend to sit back and just observe and look. So they are people that gather data and facts and information before they respond. So they're quiet people until a firm stand has to be made, if there's really something that's upset them. So depending on a person's social brain mode, they will react differently. And so this is our clue to why we have disaffect with people, because we are actually processing and needing information and needing different words for our brain to be switched on and relate. So a person who is relational will often express emotion outwardly, such as anger when they do not get their needs met. So this just tends to be their added frustration because they're not stopping and thinking about asking a question, but they immediately can go to their anger mode. A person who is mentally orientated will often not show their immediate reactions and will go inwardly and worry about an incident and feel anxious or disinterested. So that, of course, if you're a relational person relating to a mind person, then of course you're not connecting in the way that you actually process. And when you know this, then it helps you to accommodate it. So a person who's action orientated, when they get upset, they will just do and move about to get their needs met. So that you probably can observe yourself and see what it is your reaction when you feel that sense of frustration. Now, of course, I've spoiled your visits to the coffee shop and watching TV, because you'll be looking at people's hand movements and deciding how their brain is wired. Certainly when I first learnt this information, I was very skeptical, and I thought, oh, it's not as simple as that, surely. Anyway, I started to watch people on television and I thought, my goodness, that actually is true. You do see these horizontal movement, the vertical movement, and the sagittal plane movement, which I was not familiar with that expression. And so I then, bit by bit, I became aware, because it's holographic. It doesn't matter what it is. It's in your eyes, it's in your hand movements, it's in your posture, it's in the speed and tone of your voice. So there is a series of quite definite patterns, but we don't look at people in this way. We tend to think, oh, well, they react like we do. So we're working from our own perspective. So I'm sure you'll find that this is fascinating. And as I said, it will ruin your future visits to your coffee lounges, because now you'll have these conversations. So this is only the beginning of the story of how we can help you. So it's just giving you the first clue to understanding that there is a social brain. There's 6 of them, and they're all wired in a different combination. And so obviously in the work I do is I assist people and families so that if you've got, sometimes you'll find that your children have inherited the same social brain as their parents. But if not, like in my family, I was the only one of my particular social brain. So I often felt very strange and very isolated in my family because I didn't feel all that well understood. And usually now looking back on my family, I can understand because there were quite different ways that we all processed. So which one of the 6 social brains have you inherited? And as I said in the beginning, this is not your final story. It's just a default setting. Under stress, you tend to revert to this. And it depends on which part of the brain you respond from. So the first way is how we process, as I've mentioned, and now which part of the brain to respond from. And what you value and focus your attention on gives you a clue to how that works and how it impacts your behavior. So there are 3 main networks of the brain that are involved. So they now know it's not just a part of the brain that's involved. All of our reactions and actions come from our frontal brain, obviously, but the whole brain is involved and it needs to be integrated, which is obviously the work that Reza does, where he gets the physical intelligence organized so that then you can work with the social and the emotional intelligence once the physical intelligence is in place. So the network that goes from the frontal brain to the brainstem is focused on action. And the part that goes from the limbic brain to the neocortex is focused on the emotional, relational aspects of our functioning. And the neocortex, you focus on ideas and thinking. So we have these 3 different networks, and it seems that one of these is dominant when we are born. And then because there are 3 parts of our being, we have a physical being, which is run by the action part. We have a relational being, which is run by the emotional, relational part of us. And then we have a mind part, which is run by our thinking part. So there's really 3 parts to who we are. We are physical, we are intellectual, and we are spiritual or relational. And as a result of that, these have different information processing systems, and they have different ways of being activated in the way the brain functions. So we inherit 2 of those areas, one to a high degree, one to a lesser degree, and one that we miss. And so if you're not familiar with the brain, this demonstrates to you where the brainstem and cerebellum function, the limbic brain and the neocortex. And so a lot of the work that we're involved in the clinic is to really ensure that the brainstem, which is responsible for our survival mechanisms, is connected effectively to the limbic brain, so that the limbic brain can then respond and register what's happening in our external environment and internal environment by our emotional feedback. And then obviously we have to think about how we're going to respond and address that. And some of these things are quite automatic, but the more that we are able to observe ourselves and to function in that way, then we learn an awful lot about just observing the other person and then observing our reactions to it. So it's that ability to reflect which enables us to grow and develop. So we have 6 ways of perceiving or seeing or perceiving the world. Now I'm going to show you people who work in this particular plane, both adults and children. And you can see maybe when you look at these people at the type of smile they have, the type of eyes and the functioning. And if you ever look at videos of these people, you will see the whole person and how they react in different ways with their hand movements. So if you watch Michelle Obama, her hand movements are big and sweeping in the way that she talks if you watch any of her interviews. Whereas Prince Harry is also a relational mode, but he works from the action mode. So therefore, he's very warm, very friendly, very connected, and very engaged with people. Whereas Michelle Obama is a very strong, she works from the mind part. So she's all about ideas and making ideas work. Whereas the relational action person is, like Harry, is all about connecting with people. Then we have the mind examples where Obama is a mind, first of all, and so you can see with his hand movements, but he's relational, so he tends to attune and pick up on what's happening with people around him. Then you've had the Queen, who's a mind action part. So these people are very good at systems, but you see that in the mind people, you don't have as much expression on their face. They obviously do express it, but it's not the first thing that you see. When they're listening to you and observing you, they don't show much expression. And then we have the doing. The Dalai Lama is action mind, so he works from his thinking part and about putting those, making those ideas work in practice. So he's all about objectives. So just to go back, the Michelle Obama is all about the goal. Harry's all about connection. Barack Obama's all about purpose. The Queen's all about systems and principles. And the Dalai Lama's all about objectives and making them work in practice. And Kate Middleton is an action relational. So she's a person that is very much about connecting with people, wanting to know a lot about the data and the facts and the information. So you can see in her eyes how she looks in relation to Michelle Obama. Michelle Obama is a very intense feeling a person, whereas Kate, when you watch her, she's an observer. And you see the same thing with the Dalai Lama. So that's some examples of famous people that are one of these different social brains. So now let's look at the children. So if you've got a child at home, this is the purple child. Sorry, I haven't introduced the notion of colours. So this is the relational mind. So the idea here is that she's interactive, but she makes ideas work in practice. And then you see the difference between these two relational people is that is very expressive, the relational action child. Here, the mind relational. So they're observing, they're picking up, they're taking in, but not seeing much expression on their face. And then you look at the Kate Middleton's daughter is the same as the Queen. So this is where you see it inherited in a family. So she is mind action. So she's got that very upright position, but she is observing and not showing as much of the expression or smile on her face. Then you move to the action mind. So there is that regarding, it's soft, it's gentle in her energy that they exude. And whereas the action relational person is a little bit like the relational mind person, but they are soft and gentle and they tend to observe and take in information first before they react. So the relational are highly interactive. The mind tend to think and observe. The action just get on and do. So that's giving you some quick overview of the 6 different types. Any questions before I go on?
Arini, is it more difficult to determine the social dynamic in children compared to adults, or is it the same?
Yes, in some ways, but I think it's because we haven't been trained to look at these sorts of qualities, we don't tend to see them. So I found that even when I used to go, when I was working with childcare, I could go into the baby's room and you would at least see actions. Like, for example, my youngest granddaughter, when she moved in her bed or moved her arms went up like this and down like this, up like this and down like this, even though she was just a newborn. So it was the way, whereas other babies, you find they go this way. So this is why hand movements are useful, because you'll always see a baby moving their hands in a particular plane. And I didn't think, I was very skeptical to start with, and I thought, surely it does not like that. Because picking up the other expressions is harder, because when you say they've got a really brilliant smile, well, everybody smiles, but understanding the difference in the smile is something that you acquire. But certainly that's why I suggest hand movements are the easiest to look at.
Thanks.
Okay, move on. So our third secret is to turn our frustrations back to fascinations. So once you understand that we're not trying to be difficult, we are just, that's the way our brain has been wired to function as a default setting. Now you can learn other ways of being, but you never change the actual verbal and non-verbal characteristics. They are always there. But as we integrate ourselves, it's the third area, which is learning to understand what are the virtues or qualities of character that we need to strengthen, because we tend to do what we do naturally and what are our natural strengths. And so how often have you heard the expression opposites attract? This is because we have the most to learn from them. And so often our soul energy understands our journey, but our ego doesn't. And so, of course, we get very upset when somebody behaves in a way that we don't understand in working with it. But if we understand that we are naturally wired differently, then we can ask that question like I did to my husband. So how could I have handled that situation? Well, ask me questions. He's interactive. So therefore, he needed that interaction from me. So usually a partner that we choose has a different social brain to us. They counterbalance us. They are a complement to us. And that's why, first of all, we are totally fascinated, because we think, oh, that's so different to the way I operate. Then, of course, when we live with the reality, we have to deal with the constant irritant and frustration that comes. Now, understand that your irritant is really important. So I'll give you an example. Is that I'm a person that would be naturally optimistic. So if I'm dealing with people who are critical or are naysayers, I find I really become reactive to that. And so I tend to want to do more and more of my optimism, and they want to do more and more of what I'm not seeing as being analytical, because I'm only focusing on the downside of doing too much of a particular quality. So that person is being very analytical, but in my view, they're being critical because I'm coming from another value system. I am being optimistic and I'm wanting to look at all the positives, not the negatives. Now, if I know that about myself, when I'm dealing with somebody who I find overly critical, I can feel in my body my reaction to it, but I can reframe it in my head and saying, oh, that person is being very analytical and very realistic. And maybe I need to not be so optimistic in this situation. I need to look at how I can be realistic. So we can help you to identify yours and your family's and everyone's social brain around you that you relate to closely. And of course, this is very valuable for families because you now have a language in which you can actually connect and relate to each other. And I find that children particularly have a fascination with this. So my grandchildren would say, Grandy, can you talk about the colours? And I had a purple and actually what I've done with this is to assist you to actually deal with this. I've given each of these social brains a colour, only simply because it's easier to refer to than remember the two words that work of how you process information and what information you process. So, for example, if you're a relational person and your person asks you, what did you do today? It has no impact. And if somebody says that to me as a relational person, I actually am moving forward. My time zone, because we all have a different time zone, is moving forward. And then I've really got to stop and think what it is. Whereas if somebody asked me how I felt or what was interesting or what was exciting about your day, you will immediately engage in an animated conversation. My granddaughter, first day at school, same colour as myself, same social brain. So I say to her, how was your day? And she said, fine. And I thought, oh, I know better than this. So then I said, what was exciting or interesting about your day today? And she immediately went to an incident that happened at lunchtime. And we had a 15-minute conversation. And so often when I work with mothers, they complain that their children come home from school, particularly when they're young, and they want to know what's happening in their child's life. And they ask the wrong action word and they don't get the response they're wanting. Ask the right action word, your brain triggers then all the memories in the right direction. And it's the same with your partner. If you're actually asking them the wrong action word, you're not going to hear very much about their day. So when you understand what words to use and how to connect to your partner and others, they will immediately give you their attention and listen attentively. There are stages of relations, simply put, and you can look at this, what stage are you in? So this, first we norm, are you the same as me? Then we storm, no, you are different. Then we reform our understanding of each other, particularly if we understand the social brain. Then we finally perform and develop harmonious relationships. So relationships need to be built. It's some people we click with and happen to immediately have a connection. They are usually the same social brain as yourself or have the same way of processing information. But if they're very different from you, whilst you might find them still fascinating, there is more chance for conflict. So just to give you a couple of examples of how this plays out in real life situations. So a purple is sharing an idea with an orange, and the orange looked up to acknowledge the person who has entered the room. And the purple stops talking as they consider the orange is not interested. The orange would consider it rude not to acknowledge the person who has entered the room. So here we have this real disconnect between, even though they both process the information relationally, because purple is relational mind, orange is relational action. And so purple needs eye contact to know if a person is interested. So if a person moves their eyes away, then that person, the purple immediately will say that person's not interested. When in actual fact, the orange works through their audio function, not their visual spatial. So we use different perception modes to interpret the world. So the orange is audio and can multi-process and is still listening, as well as acknowledging the newcomer. So we've had children that really, that changes the relationship overnight when an orange mother can sit down with their purple child and sit and look directly into their eyes, but not keep moving around and working and expecting their purple child to be following what they're saying. So if the purple knows this about an orange, they can continue talking and think and not think that they're disinterested. So this is a marvelous way of understanding. And to do this, you've got to feel your body reaction inside of yourself when you feel that sense of disconnect that happens. And then if you're present enough, of course, you can ask the other person and saying, is it okay to continue talking? And the orange will say, yes, yes, I'm listening. And then they get to know that you actually are listening at the same time. So to give another example, the green, which is mind first, then action, like the Queen. Orange, which is like Prince Harry. So an orange is emotionally upset and wishes to share their story of the incident. The green immediately wants to fix the issue by taking the necessary action because they are mind action. The orange is now more upset and angry that the green is not showing sympathy to them. So the orange needs to process out loud. So instead of doing all that thinking inside of themselves like a mind person would, the green would, they actually need to get it out and hear themselves speak and they're not looking for you to give an answer. They're actually just wanting, they're processing it out loud, because then they can actually make sense of it themselves. And so they process it out loud to solve the problem. And the green thinks internally what act to take to fix it. All the orange wanted was a listening ear. So they needed to ask up front, can you listen while I share my story? I do not want a solution. I just want you to acknowledge my feelings. And so if you know that, then it's very easy for the green men who think that they've got to find solutions to anything that's happening with their close associates who might be an orange. And so they tend to, because they're not relational themselves, they miss that area, and the orange misses the mind area. So they're a wonderful complement to each other and quite fascinated when they first meet each other. But soon, when the orange is not emotionally validated, they feel their husband no longer, or their wife no longer loves them. So all the greens need to say is, you must be feeling very sad or disappointed. And the orange will then feel that they've been respectfully listened to. But the green thinks, my goodness, how did that make a difference? Because it's actually not fixing anything, because their brain is set to fix things. Whereas the orange is set to create harmony and they're very honest in their interactions with people. So they are very good at customer service and being very present with people, whereas the green's very good at fixing systems and things, big picture things where it's important to make things function. So just to give you one more example, the blue has shared with the red an overview of what needs to be done. And a red has not completed. So the blue is mind relational, the red is action relational. So they share the same ending. In other words, they process through their limbic brain and they are tuned to people, but they have a very different way of processing. So the blue processes through thinking about things, the red processes through action. And the blue thinks that the red is going to be able to do the task. And when they come back, the red has not completed the task in time. So the blue feels let down that they have not completed the task as agreed to, because each of these colors have certain values that are important. So the blue is integrity is really important to them, so that the person will do what they've agreed to. But here in this particular case, the red does not have enough specific details and the nature of the context to complete the exercise, because the blue works from a big picture and they're looking at the purpose of things, whereas the red is looking at everything being very specific and very detailed, because they have a series of tasks to accomplish. They need all the facts and all the data in order to do it into the degree that the person wants. So the red says, just tell me the priority and I will do it. I had a person that I was working with in the United States, and I'd get so frustrated with her because I would think that she understood what to do, and I'd come back and she hadn't completed it. And I was big picture and not giving her all the context for her to even work out the details. So when you see this mismatch between, do you need high context, do you need high detail, do you need it in a relational form, do you need it in an action form? So in many ways, they would feel incompetent if another person did that to them. So the blue doesn't want to give all that information. And so then the red needs to speak up and say, what are your priorities? Because that's one of the areas they miss the mind principle, which means that they don't always analyze and think something through. They're doing it. They're doing it in relationship to what's needed in the environment. So maybe we could pause there a moment and any comments, any reactions, any questions?
I find that it's a fascinating new way to look at people and reactions, and I can already see things in my family where people are particular things and why this is not working. Yes.
Yes, I think that it certainly reframed all of my relationships. You know, when I could look back and see the members of my family. So my mother was relational action, which was orange. My father was a yellow, which was action, mind. My older sister was a green, and so she was mind, action. My next sister was the same as my father, which was action, mind. And my younger sister was same as my mother, which was relational action. And I was purple, which was relational mind. And so you can see we don't have all the colours present in our family. But now I could understand why I saw the world so differently. But I relate it best to my younger sister because we had the same way of processing. And I think it seems to be that either the beginning part of it's the same, it's an easier way to relate. But what the second part is how you respond or react to situations. And so that often is really important. So we choose a mate that often is a compliment to us, but then, or our friends are often very similar to ourselves. So that's why our friendships are much easier, but it doesn't cause us to grow because it's that creative conflict, that creative tension or the irritant. So if you know how pearls are formed, it's a grain of sand that becomes an irritant. And so taking really good note of your irritants is absolutely vital to understanding how to integrate yourself, because it's more a reflection of yourself of what you are doing too much of, because we're bound in by our strength. And we tend to, it's like a hammer. If you've got a hammer, everything is a nail. And so you do more and more and more of it. And then as Reza says, you get a weak muscle and then you overextend it. So it's understanding this beautiful process of how to counterbalance. So going back to my example of me being an optimist and being really irritated by people who are critical, who are acting out of the positive of being analytical, I can't change them, but I can change myself and say, I need to be more real or more practical or more take in more detail and more facts of the context and the situation. So I become more pragmatic or more realistic. So now I'm doing the work on myself rather than expecting my partner or other people around me to change. I'm now saying what is that I need to change in myself. And this is the most liberating thing to do, because you no longer spend your energy trying to do something that you can't do because it's the other person. But of course, both people have to want to do this so you can have the lovely conversations about how this, and then you have a lot of fun in your relationship because you can then laugh at your foibles. Reza, do you want to share any stories that you've had in your experience of you working with this?
I believe over the last 30 years of my career on this path of the brain function and behavior, I found this protocol to be the most effective and most powerful. All I can say is that once we really understand the dynamics of the people we live in and the people we have relationship with, or our employees, our staff, I've found that up to 80% of conflicts can be resolved very quickly. I've seen phenomenal changes in people, parents' relationships, my own relationships, and how understanding even my wife, how I'm a relations mind and she's mind relation, to understand that I may be, I've been in the past where I used to, for example, if she would give if she's discussing an idea, she's talking about what is she thinking. So where it may not match the way I was looking at the situation because I was looking at the relational concept. Now I just listen because she's communicating in a way that I do not communicate. But so I found that by understanding her picture, she has a much better sense of being accepted and listened to. And when my time comes in, I express about my feelings or my interactions with the relational aspects of the concept, and she listens to, and is a win-win for both of us. Very, very effective. I've seen it with parents who, after you have identified their dynamics, especially teenage children, then the parents have far greater tools to understand the need of that child at that age and how to communicate with them. And all of these behavior communication is based on what our soul needs to learn. So understanding what the values of each dynamics give parents a leverage how to reach to the child's best virtuous quality and work from there to communicate with them. And they respond quite well. This is my observation from your work. It's been very good. Thank you, Irene.
There's, perhaps I can just share with you a couple of examples of what, so that we tend to project onto another what we need in a situation without checking what works for the other, which is my story about the window. So the real short answer is that the answer lies in the other person, but we need to ask questions of that. So, when we look at the example of, let me just go to a couple of examples here. And where somebody wrote to me and they said, "Thank you so much for your help. You have indeed restored my hope. This week is progressing much better with Kerry, with me being more open about my feelings. We're keen to all meet with you Tuesday so we can get some clues from John. Thank you once again. Your work is incredible." And so it's another couple that I worked with who were a red and I think a blue in colour. And so they said, "Last Thursday was a light bulb moment. In the 22 years of our relationship, we can't even begin to thank you enough for what you have added to our family." And so it's very, as you can imagine, very rewarding work when you actually, so this is an example, the next one, of an orange mother and a purple child. She said, "It was such a pleasure to meet you also and be part of your amazing workshop. I've had such a noticeable improvement in our home already. Just by making eye contact with my younger son, by involving him, it's incredible. And with my older son also, I am still blown away by it all." So she had a purple child and a yellow child. And the biggest mistake that she was, or at least the disconnect that was happening between herself and her son, was that she was, as an orange, being busy acting and doing, and the purple just needed to actually look in her eyes because they interpret everything through the eyes. So for a person who is a relational mind, they need to be able to think about what they're actually interacting about. And if they can't see the person's reactions in their eyes, and if a person wears sunglasses, it's like they're blind. They really can't even operate with that person in the area. But if you know that you absolutely hate it, that when a person wears sunglasses, then you know that you could be a purple colour. But the colours were only used as a basis, or they're also as a metaphor, because it's to understand that white light is made up of all the colours. And so it's understanding that no one colour or one way of seeing the world is more important. So it's a bit like a system of a tree, is that the tree, the purple is like the photosynthesis process between the tree and the sunshine. Very big picture, and looking at the trends and looking at possibilities. Whereas the leaves are like the blue, so they are more confined in their area, but they adjust and change according to the conditions, so that they have a certain degree of, they have the ability to take the vision and translate it through people. So they are mind relational. Then you'll see the branches are like the yellow, which is action mind, and they are very supportive, very helpful people, and often the IT people, because they're high detail, high context. Whereas the tree trunks are like the green, because they are very principled people and they're much into the structure of how things work. And so they're very stable and very much based on action and systems. And then you'll find that the orange are like the sap of the tree. They're very mercurial, very adaptable. They can be very chameleon. They can be a bit of everything. So they adjust according to where they find themselves. And then the roots of the tree are like the red, which is the action relational. And so they tend to find their way around any problem, no matter what it is, and even in the dark, because they have this ability to intuit and to see things from the past, the present, the future. And then they gather data and information, and then collectively they bring it together. So it's understanding that the more that we understand what our colours are, then we know what our gifts are to the team. And we also know what our gifts are to the family, but we also know who to learn from. So I found that often if your partner is a particular colour, I would have girlfriends that were that colour, or and then I'd go to them and say, how would I say this? Or how could I put it in a way that would be meaningful? So in other words, everybody becomes a resource around you. And of course, the advantage of studying it, knowing what colour you are, then you've got something that you can actually work with. How's that time going?
Time's going well. That was a beautiful analogy, very clear and direct. I loved it. I have another question in the chat. It says, how is it that kids or siblings, when young, fight with each other a lot, but as they grow older, they can become closer? Is it something to do with time, or, what's your perspective on this?
Yes, I often laugh that we spend all of our childhood and our adolescence storming with our family and getting particularly irritated. And this is a perfect example of the early stages of development, as our egos are so strong, and the formation of ourselves as a personal identity. With children, you have this clashes because they see the world so differently. And they're usually in a family, we don't have we might have the same colour between parents and child, but certainly amongst children, they're different. So you'll see the greater clashes, the more different the way of processing and responding is. But by the time we become more towards the latter part of our teenage life, is that we start to understand each other more. Now, because I've had the advantage of I've got 5 grandchildren, so I happen to be fortunate to have known this information, which I've been working with for the last 20 years, is that my grandchildren became fascinated with it. And so when I was working with them, we would explain how they worked. And I found that, for example, one time Reza and I were doing a course on spirituality, and the parents came with their 5-year-old son, and I'd done a very brief description of what it was all about. And at the end of the session, this little boy says, "I'm a red." And I actually thought, how could he have figured that out, from the little bit of information that I gave him? And surely he was. His grandfather was a red. So you sometimes don't inherit from the parents, you inherit from the grandparents. And so then you can go to the red grandfather, and if you're having challenges handling your child and you're a different colour, you ask him and you say, so you use him as a resource to know how that works. But I think it's also an indicator that third area that is not natural to us. So we have inherited, we have innate qualities, and the third area are the acquired qualities. Those qualities of character we have to learn, that we educate our children in. So if for example, my granddaughter, who's the same as myself, I knew that she'd be missing the action part, which plays out is that she has to learn to be patient, and she has to learn to be resilient, emotionally resilient in her way that she behaves. And so, and that she's always moving forward. So I said to my daughter, in the physical space, she'll be wanting to do the next task, the next play activity. I said, if you train her to actually put everything away first and then move on to the next task, I said, you will be doing yourself a great favour. And so now she's a neat freak. She would come with 5 or 6 boxes, and she knew, because she had a physical spatial memory, she'd go into the toy place, and as a small child, she'd go, so she couldn't articulate it, but she knew which box the toys were in. And so so we color-coded it all. so that we then knew, and she would very easily recognize the box, and she would play with it, and then she had to put it away. And of course, it requires the parent to do three things: to be very consistent, to be repetitive, and to be systematic in working with it. So if you know the social brain of your child, you do enormous things to help them acquire those qualities of character that will bring them balance and integrate them. So for example, a simple example for me is that I'm the same, is that the physical and the practical tasks stress me more, but I have trained myself to do them. And so often when I came home from work and I'd had a highly intellectually stimulating day, just to cook was wonderful because it earthed me. I did something practical, and you usually find when you do something in that third area that you need to balance yourself with, you bring yourself back into balance, because we tend to want to do the second part. So normally if I was upset, I'd want to talk about it. I'd want to interact with it. I'd want to make sense of it. When in actual fact, doing something was actually brought me back into integrated form in myself. And when you understand this with the question that you asked about why they change from that, then of course we get married, or we get in a relationship and we start all over again. So all of those conflicts that we had with our children, with our family, we now repeat with our next family. And then we go through the whole process again. But hopefully we're a little wiser this time.
Thank you. Are there any other questions that anyone would like to raise with the opportunity? Arini, is that the end portion of your talk, or are you just opening up for questions and answers now? Or do you have more?
Well, I think there's just a couple of other examples in that this was a particularly interesting case, because I have a son aged 5 who has had behavioural issues his whole life. He was angry, argumentative, impatient and destructive. It had gotten to the point where I had sought help from a paediatrician and been referred to a child psychologist, which I now know would have been such a complete waste of time and money. What a blessing that I attended your workshop just prior to going ahead with therapy for our son. So I think that one of the things that we have so misunderstood in the raising of our children is that if we can work with their natural style, you use your strengths to overcome your challenges. And when she understood that this child was a purple, and so often the purple child loves to have choices and they love to have interaction. And so that in engaging in any particular activity, you ask for their ideas and you go through the different ideas and you weigh them up. And then you're saying, okay, so now we can do this. But it's that process that they want to be engaged. And my granddaughter would come into the kitchen when my daughter was cooking, and she would scream and yell and carry on. She was so frustrated because she wanted to be doing and involved in what her mother was involved in. So I said to her, I know it's not very safe, but sit her on the bench and give her a spoon and help her and teach her to stir the pot and do it safely. Well, she did that immediately. Then she was calm, she was happy, she was engaged. And so all of the brain is wired to be joyful. And we move away from that which is unpleasant or which is going to bring us sadness. So it's the same with children. When children are demonstrating that they are in balance and that you're doing the right approach and the right technique with them, you'll find your children are joyful. So it's the emotional feedback you get from all the relationships around you which help you to understand, am I missing something here? Or do I need to do it differently? And so first order is to ask for their advice of how to handle it, because, or if they don't know immediately, say, maybe you could think about it. And when you've had a chance to deal with it, come back or think about what would work. Give me an answer that we can have another discussion. Because there are people that need time to think things through. And so, for example, people who are bamboozled by the relational ones, like the purple and the orange, who speak fast and process fast, and you're a social brain that maybe doesn't process as fast, then the person who doesn't process as fast can say, give me time to think about that. It's an interesting idea, but I need, rather than what the mind person tends to do is say no first, so that they know that buys them time to be able to think something through. Then often they change their mind because they've had time to think it through. So the more you know yourself, then you know what your emotional needs are and what you need in the conversation, so that you can ask for your needs to be met, rather than using difficult behaviour or where we have to get into a more dramatic form of interaction to be able to get our point across. And so often, because when we're young, we have an emotional home we go to, we actually will revert to that as soon as we're in a stressful situation. So our behaviour is not what we're proud of anymore. So it's really to understand that all behaviour is in the frontal brain, is processed through the frontal brain. So as soon as you're in the emotional state, you are now no longer have access to the frontal brain. So our behaviour, we wonder why really intelligent human beings behave in such unintelligent ways. It's because the brain downshifts into the emotional part of the brain and has no access to the repertoire from the frontal brain. So what you're trying to do in all relationships is to keep in that, what Reza talked about, is that respectful engagement, and there's 6 different types of respectful engagement. Just simply what you do with your hands, what you do with your eyes, what you do with your posture. So it's not even opening your mouth, first of all. It's just the way you are that actually our brain takes in massive amounts of information and makes assumptions. So the main thing is check every assumption.
Arini, what have you found that works, or do you have any tools in regards to larger group dynamics in terms of, there's multiple different brain dynamics in a group setting and how to...
Yeah, I mean, you can see that because it's a master pattern. You'll see that a family can be orientated towards a more dominant social brain mode because of what's happened in their tradition that's come through the family. And you can see it in nation states. So, for example, the different colours show in different ways. So, for example, if you take the United Kingdom, that is a green colour. So that is mind, action. Whereas a country like Australia has a dominance of greens because we've come from that area. But because we're so multicultural, then you'll see that different communities and different organisations tend to be impacted probably by, if you say, the leader of the group or the manager of the group. They will influence the culture of that organisation. And of course, with a group of people, it depends on your level of consciousness and understanding and your ability to be able to communicate with each other that is going to impact the quality of that area. But you can see these patterns of interaction are repeated again and again and again in a larger and larger scale. And of course, as you become integrated, as the group develops, as the group becomes more conscious of its behavior and its reactions. So often you see in teams of people a very reaction response. But of course, the other thing, just while we're talking about groups of people, is that if they're all the same colour, it's very comfortable, but you don't really achieve the best results. So that process of consultation that happens on the different perspectives. So for example, when I've worked in a group of people, knowing my own colour and knowing the colour of the people around the table, I know when to sit back and say nothing, because I think this is a very practical, this is a very realistic, a very pragmatic response that's required in this situation. Then I think that's not my strength. I don't see the world like a green would see it. And so the green, I will listen very carefully to the green person in the group, because I think they truly know what to do to structure something. Whereas if it was an event that was more future orientated and we had to develop the community in a particular way, then I think I need to persevere with getting across some concepts here. And so it gives you that ability to be able to be effective in a group, to know what it is that you're doing. So for example, Brett, in your situation where you as an orange, you're a connector. And because you pick up the feelings of everybody else in the group, then you can act as a connector and a communicator between people because you're picking up people's feelings. So you play a particular function in the group. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's the more you know about yourself, the more you know about how you can be effective in a group.
Wonderful, Arini. That was really insightful. Thank you.
Thank you, Arini. That was great.
Okay. Thank you. That went so fast. I'm amazed how quickly the time goes. And a little easier than maybe you think it's going to be.
Yeah. That was really insightful. I'm thinking about what it could look like. What would the implications would it be for a world that had this collective understanding, and how would we then be interacting with each other and the decisions we're making? It'll be really interesting to see that type of world as we kind of develop our consciousness and not just accept things for the way they are, but to actively, like you said, seek out that irritant and try to learn and understand it. Which is interesting.
Yeah, and it doesn't stop you from having misunderstandings. It's knowing that you have the knowledge of it, and that doesn't mean to say you're going to act on it. So to really be effective, there's 4 parts to developing a capability. The first part is you've got to have knowledge of it. So all I've done is share a little bit of information about the knowledge. The second part is that you need to have an attitude of openness and tolerance and understanding. So there has to be an attitudinal part to making things work. And then there is a skills part where you actually know what to say, when to say it, how to say it, and what's going on in the situation. And then there is the virtuous part, which really tips you over on the capability. Whereas, like, for example, each of us will have a particular prime virtue to learn. So maybe I'll just finish with that sort of aspect, is that for the purple, their prime thing they've first got to learn is patience with self. They want to get the job done so quickly because they want it to be efficient and organised, and they're getting on to the next thing. So being patient with themselves. Patient with others, they're okay with that, but not very patient with themselves. Whereas the blue is having to learn to be more trusting of their judgment and more expressive of their emotional needs. Whereas the green is learning to be more empathetic and more sensitive. The yellow is learning to be more expressive of their emotions. They tend to be in the we and the collective action of everybody else that are tending to their needs, but they don't really exist as an individual, and so they don't therefore honour their own emotional needs. And then you see the orange, who are needing to learn to be more objective and to be more detached and more discerning about where they put their energy and what they say, rather than just being their strength of being very honest and wanting harmony. So they've got to know when they speak up and when they don't speak up. So these are the things that you develop wisdom about. And then the red, learning to prioritize and strategize. So it's understanding that when you do this work with people, is that it's not you having to fix all these things. There's all these things that have gone wrong. You actually find when you do less of your certain strengths and more of strengthening other areas. So it's all based on the idea that we're in a process of becoming. It's not right, it's not wrong, it's not good, it's not bad. It is just exists, and it just is happening, and it's the reality of it. And then we develop strategies to integrate ourselves. And the more we do that in a group of people, and the more you've got common language, you can just have wonderful, deep discussions that are meaningful and significant because you're helping each other to grow, which is really the real purpose of a relationship and a family.